Welcome to the Pac-Man tutorial series. Based on the beloved classic arcade game Pac-Man, this project was created to be an easy-to-follow step-by-step guide that would give you the tools, techniques, and experience of creating a full game from start to finish. We've made all the original assets that we created for the game completely free. Links in the description below. For this project, if you wish to follow along step by step, you will need to first download the Pac-Man project files, both of which can be downloaded in the downloads area of the tutorial site or from links in the description.
In this Games Without Code video, we'll continue developing our gameplay by creating our power pellet power-ups, as well as adding our scoring system and scoring UI elements. So we'll begin by getting our power pellet mesh, which is under our mesh folders in our props, and it's our power pellet. So we'll start by adding a flow machine component to our power pellet. And within our flow machine, we're going to create a new macro, and we're going to save that in our macros folder, and we're going to call that power pellet macro. So for our power pellet, the functionality that we want to initially create is we want the power pellet rotating meshes to rotate while our power pellet is on screen. So let's first create a new empty game object, and we're going to call this game object rotating mesh group. And we're going to remove all our rotating meshes within this game object. And in order to do this, what we need to do is right click, and we need to unpack this prefab. And once we have it unpacked, we want to move all of our power pellet rotating meshes under the rotating mesh group. Now let's go into our flow graph and create our functionality. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a object variable, and we want to name that variable rotating mesh obj. We want to make this variable type a game object. And then we want to make our rotating mesh group the value for our variable. Next, we want to use the rotate to rotate our mesh each frame. So we're going to add that to our update. So once we move our object variable into our graph, we want to get the transform component and rotate the transform component on that. Next, we want to set our duration, and we're going to set that to 1, and we want it to rotate in our Y value. So we're going to put that rotation at about 80. And we also want to make sure our mode is set to our local axis add. With that, let's hit play to test that out. We can now see that we have the elements of our power pellet rotating. And if we want to change that speed to make that rotate a little bit faster, we can increase the amount that it rotates per second. With that complete, let's create a prefab of our power pellet and then open our level 01 scene. So we're going to just add that into our props folder. So in our level 01 scene, let's first begin by adding our power pellets to where they're going to be placed in our level. Next, let's create an empty game object, and we're going to call that power pellets, and we're going to put all of our power pellets as children of that game object. Now that we have our power pellets in place, let's go into our flow graph for our power pellet and begin creating our functionality. But before we begin implementing our functionality, let's first walk through the logic that we want to put in place for our power pellet. So like with our dots, what we want to happen with the power pellet is once the player interacts with the power pellet, we want them to appear as they're consuming the power pellet, and then we want it to activate our power up mode. We then want our power up mode to last for a certain number of seconds, and then we want our chomp character to go back to our normal mode. So we want to start by creating 3 variables. We want to create one Boolean variable, and we're going to call that is power up. And then we want to create 2 float variables, and we're going to call one power up time, and we're going to call the second one current power up time. So with our variables created, we want to start creating our logic by first creating a on trigger enter. And next we want to create a component compare tag, and we want to use our scene player tag as the tag that it compares. From there, we want to use our branch node, and we want to say if that tag matches the character, then we want it to set our is powered up boolean, and we want to set that to true. And once it's set to true, we want it to destroy that game object. Before we continue, for the sake of organization, let's also create a group for our power pellet rotation as well as our power pellet trigger. So now we have our basic power pellet functionality created. We need to create the functionality for our chomp character also that we want to happen once the power up begins. So let's select our chomp character, and we're going to go to our state machine graph, and we're going to create another super state, and we're going to call that player state. With our player state created, let's double click and go inside of our super state. So for our starting state, let's select that, and we're going to rename that to normal. And we can remove all the components that are inside the state for the moment. And we want to right click and create a new state, and we're going to call this state powered up. And we want to create a transition from our normal state into our powered up state. And let's go within that transition. So for this transition, all that we want to say is once our powered up equals to true, we want it to transition to our powered up state. So we're going to do that by using a branch node, and we're going to get the value from our boolean, and we're going to just say if that's true, we want it to transition to the next state. Now let's select all these nodes, and we're going to copy these, and let's make a transition from our powered up state back to our normal state, and we're going to paste those in that transition, and we're going to say if that's false, we want that to go back to our normal state. So with our transitions created, let's go into our power up state. So the logic that we're going to use for our powered up state is going to be very similar to our blinked state, because we want the character to be in the state for a certain amount of time, and then after that time is up, we want it to then transition back to our normal state. So for the time, we're going to use our variable that we created called power up time, and we're going to compare that powered up time with the current time. And once the current time equals 0, we want our is powered up to be false, and then we want it to transition back to our normal state. So let's start by getting our power up time, and then we want that power up time to set our current power up time. And for the moment, let's use a on enter state. So every time the state is entered, it's going to set our current time to our power up time. And from there, we want to use a time.delta time, and we want to subtract that from our current power up time. And then we want to use the time that it subtracts to set that new current power up time. And from this point, we're going to check to see that, so if that time equals or is less than 0, we want it to set our is powered up boolean to false, which will transition us back to our normal state. So before we continue, let's test this out, and let's put a time in our power up time, and we're going to go with 10 seconds. So before we test this out, we need to do a couple things. Let's go back into our main state machine, and let's set this to toggle start. And also let's go into our power pellet, and we're going to open our prefab, and we're going to add a sphere collider, and we're going to make the radius of where it encompasses our rotating mesh, and we're going to set that to is trigger. Now with that complete, let's go and let's test out our functionality. So we can see that the moment the player eats the pellet, we start our countdown, and the moment that the countdown is equal to or below 0, we now have that is power up off. And we can go to our chomp character, let's go into our state, and we can see that state is transitioned back to normal. So currently the functionality that we have in place will only allow the current time to be set the moment the player eats the power pellet. However, if they eat an additional power pellet, the current time will remain the same and the additional time won't be taken into account. So we need to add the functionality that every time the player eats the power pellet, the current power pellet time equals the original power pellet time. So we're going to select our power pellet and go into our flow graph. So we want the power pellet itself to actually set our power pellet time instead of it being set within the state of the player. So we're going to add it right before it destroys the game object. And we want to add a set variable, and we want the power up time to set the current time. And let's go on our character in our player state, and let's remove our on enter state since we're setting it within the actual power pellet itself. So let's test that out and make sure that our functionality is working correctly. So we can see now, once we got the additional power pellet, it actually set our power pellet time back to our original power up time. All right, so next let's begin creating our UI elements. So we're going to start by creating a UI text. And within this text, what we're going to do is we're going to change our font, and we're going to change our color to increase the size a bit. And we're also going to click our anchor presets, hold shift and control, and we're just going to scale that out to the maximum amount of our canvas for now. Let's go to our front view, and for our canvas, we're going to change that from screen space to camera, and we're going to drag our main camera onto our canvas. And let's change our distance from 100. We're going to make that about 25. And let's move our text. Since we want this to be our score text, we're going to move this to the right side of our screen. And let's just increase our text size as well. And now to duplicate this, and we're going to move our duplicate under score. We're going to switch our font back to Arial. Increase our text size just a bit, and let's adjust the color of that text also. And we're going to rename one to score and the other one to score text. We're going to take both of these and we're going to duplicate these and move to the other side. We're going to change the name of this to lives and lives text. And we're going to hold Control Shift to move our object as well as our anchor points. And we're going to change this text back to main pac-man text. We're going to grab our lives UI object and we're going to duplicate that, and let's remove our text component. And we're going to add a horizontal layout group component. We're going to say our child control size and our child control height, and we're going to move our lives in to be a child of the lives with the horizontal layout group component. I'm going to change this to lives layout. So doing this will allow us, every time that another life is added, we continue adding that into our into our layout. And then we want to change our force expansion, and we're going to take our width off of our force expansion so that all of our lives start from the left and we can just continue on instead of being separated. So next, let's create an empty game object, and we're going to place our UI elements under that empty game object, and we're going to call this game object UI elements. So now let's begin creating our score functionality. So to begin, we're going to need to create 4 variables. One will store our UI score game object, and the other will store our player score, and the other 2 will define the points for our power pellet and for our dots. So for our power pellets, we're going to have 50 for our value, and for the dots, we're going to have 10 for our value. So let's first begin with our dots. So for the dots, we're going to go to our dots flowchart. So the logic that we want to put in place is every time that the player gets a dot, it adds that point value into their score. We want to put this right before the game object is destroyed. So to do this, we want to get the player score as well as getting the value for the worth of the dots, and then we want to use that added value to set the new player score. So since we're doing the same for our power pellets, what we can do is we can just grab these nodes that we created, and we're just going to copy these and we're going to paste these into the flow graph for our power pellet. And let's also grab that play sound one shot to have that sound reinforcement for when the player gets our power pellet as well. Next, we need to add the logic that displays the player's score to the player. So we're going to go onto our scene manager and we're going to create a flow machine. And we're going to create a macro, and we're going to name that scene score macro, and we're going to save that into our macros folder. And the logic that we want to create is fairly simple. We just want our UI text to update to the current player score. So we're going to use our update node, and from that we want to get the component from our player score object variable, and we want it to set that game object's text component. So since our text component needs a string for input, what we need to do once we get the score is we also need to change that integer into a string. So now that we have all that complete, let's go back and make sure that we adjust the variables that we paste in, and we want to make sure that that's using our points from our power up instead of the points from our dots. So last but not least, let's add the sound effect to when our player is powered up. So what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate our sound effect game object, and we're just going to call this power up audio source. And let's set that to loop. Let's turn our volume to about 0.5, and we're going to get our power pellet sound effect, and just going to add that into our clip. Now let's go to our scene variables, and let's create a variable for our power up audio source game object. And we're going to make this game object an audio source. So let's go to our chomp character and let's go to our player state, and we want to make sure when this is in normal, we want to make sure our audio source is off. So we're going to add a on enter state, and when the state is enter, what we want it to do is deactivate our power up audio source. So we're going to use a set enable for our audio source, and we're going to make sure that that is unchecked. And let's copy this and let's go into our powered up. I'm just going to paste this in and we're just going to check this. So with that complete, let's hit play and test out our gameplay functionality so far. So now that we have our power pellets and our scoring system complete, in the next lesson, we're going to break down the game design and the game mechanics for our game.
Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to be the first to see this and many other tutorials, game development tips, interviews, and free game asset giveaways.